you all for being here. My name is Hannah Barco. I'm Associate Curator and Festival Director here at Tephra ICA. I had the pleasure of working with Deirdre Darden and all of the artists to help make this show come together and share this work with you all tonight and all of the audiences to come. I want to share a little bit about the history of this exhibition. The Mary B. Howard Invitational is a long-standing biennial program of Tephra ICA, formerly Greater Reston Arts Center, funded through Mary B. Howard, who was a board member, staunch supporter, and artist herself, and left the funds to ensure that this organization would always be supporting and showing regional artists. So the invitational happens every 2 years. We always work with a guest curator, put out an open call. We had over 75 applications responding to Deirdre's amazing prompt. What would your artwork look like if you were well rested? How would you conceive of your practice if all of your needs were met? And among all of the amazing portfolios and responses to that prompt, we have this incredible cadre of women artists in this show that Deirdre's been working with to bring this together. I'm going to pitch it to them to talk about the work and the content, but I just want to let you know that this program happens every 2 years, and so it's always a different guest curator and a different set of regional artists. Excited to share this with you tonight. Deirdre's been amazing to work with. Her curatorial practice started with Black Artists BC, born and raised in BC, and has a number of incredible shows under her belt, touching on themes of race, female experience, societal pressures, and to be in conversation with you, Deirdre, about everything you're researching and thinking about, and to get to know these artists' work through your eyes has just been an incredible honor. And so now you get to do that too. Welcome everyone. I will say on top of that survey that Lisa just shared with us, we also have a post-program survey. If you have it in you to do 2 surveys, after we talk, we learn about the work, we'll have some time to speak with the artists, grab another glass of wine or cup of tea, and please also give us your feedback as we continue to bring art into this space and to share with all of you. All right, Deirdre, I'm handing it over.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hannah, for that introduction. And for welcoming me, into the gallery, inviting me to guest curate. It has been my honor as well. So, like they said, I'm Deirdre Darden, the guest curator for this show, independent curator, born and raised, I like to say on art in Washington, DC. And so just to segue into our talk and a little bit of background about how I arrived at rest as a topic for this show and for the open call on those questions that I mentioned. During the pandemic at the beginning, like many people, is kind of placed on a forced hiatus, I like to call it, which is a little joke from TV show called 30 Rock, in 2020, and staying home. And in general, I kind of have the tendency to recharge in solitude, I guess. Like I'm in between maybe being an extrovert and an introvert, and I like having alone time to kind of reevaluate. And so that is where I was sort of placed, like many people, during the pandemic. And I started without work, sort of just reevaluate work and my independent curatorial practice. And I spent more time online, joining like Reddit and other online group communities. And I kind of fell into this movement talking about the soft life and other pages. One is called the Nap Ministry. There's a Instagrammer goes by Zebla Bay, who does these like someday sort of like a wrap up of the week, like all these pictures, and it would just be people resting, people having tea, just these like quiet moments. And I really just like dove into that research. So when I was approached by Tephra to put the show together, that's really the only kind of concept that I was personally thinking about, and really knew that there was this sort of subtle movement in art that I was seeing. A lot of people were looking towards rest as a subject matter and really contemplating it and the negotiations that we have to go through in order to get to rest. especially as independent artists. You know, we're always kind of looking towards what's next. And even some of us here, I think, have multiple shows at the same time as this one, and full-time jobs, and tried to get rest. And we could hear rest and rested. Do that, but so that's kind of where I came from to the show, and where the title is between a rock and a soft place, and that journey that rest can take you to that soft place. So I want to kick it off, I guess, with Deborah, and if the artist, if you just want to introduce yourself, maybe give like a few sentences before I get into the questions.
Well, I'm Deborah,
Yeah.
also a native Washingtonian. And my studio is based in Northeast Washington, DC, where I was originally, where I grew up. And I'm largely a printmaker. I'm working in different processes within printmaking.
And her work is behind us here on this wall and around the corner. And so I know when we spoke first, we had, let me let you all introduce yourselves first, actually.
Oh, okay. My name is Holly Bass, and I'm based in Washington, DC. My practice is primarily durational performance art, but I also make video works and installations.
And your video is on the other side of this wall.
We have X-ray vision.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Katie O'Keefe. I grew up in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley. And then I moved down to Baltimore, where I've been living there on and off about cumulatively 12 years. And I am primarily a fiber artist who also works in paper. And my work is over here. Most of my work has to do with my journey with self-healing, having chronic illness.
My name is Britt. I'm a native Washingtonian, born and raised. I am a filmmaker and theater artist, and recently have gotten into creating 3D and installation pieces around the subject of the film works that I create. And my work is this, this piece in this corner back here.
Is her own room.
Yeah.
A wing.
Thanks.
And my name is Julia Burrows, and I'm originally from Chicago, but I've called Northern Virginia my home for over 20 years. I'm a printmaker by trade, but I also consider myself a mixed media artist. So I paint, and lately I've been concerned about marrying printmaking with 3D forms. And my work is here and around here.
Thank you, yeah. Okay, so to start with you, Deborah, if you want to maybe just talk about the research that you did, and what drew you to these particular subjects in your series.
Sure. So I'm kind of a left-right brain person, and I was actually doing some scholarly writing on segregated hospitals in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. And then digging around archives and visiting hospitals, mostly in the US, southern portion of the US. And the images here are from photos that we literally found on a shelf in a basement in a hospital in North Carolina of people. And there was a physician, I guess, who was taking these pictures and documenting them. I'm not quite sure for what purposes. And I was doing this writing at the very time that the pandemic hit. And so I thought, probably not a good time to be delving into this during a pandemic, but nevertheless, there were some really interesting parallels between the health disparities that we were, that was being really spotlighted during the pandemic, who was getting sick, who was ill, who had careers that privileged them enough to be able to stay home, who had to come out and be more exposed and become ill. And, I'm looking at this at the same time I'm looking at health and science in the earliest 20th century. And again, the disparities, how certain people's behaviors or illnesses were pathologized, even when they weren't illnesses, but they were pathologized anyway. And so looking at those definitions, people's desire to want to be free was considered pathology. You know, people who were really trying to fight for full citizenship and full control over their bodies was considered a problem. And so I started writing about this and then looking at the images and really trying to imagine the worlds that these people in the images were entitled to that they didn't have. And so I was kind of imagining what those worlds look like.
Mhm. And after we spoke, I sort of dove into my own thinking about Cromwell Hospital and the hospital in Virginia where they recently excavated some of this similar type of imagery and articles and some records from the doctors there. And the idea that the creation of the segregated mental hospital, there's referred to as at the time as a hospital for the colored insane. And that this structure was created just as a way to continue the forced labor and forcing people into the hospitals, and then their prescription for whatever they were diagnosed with was just more work and more labor. And that the justification behind that was, you know, well, if they don't continue working, then they'll descend into some kind of madness. And just having that freedom, like you said, it's described as madness. So, you know, I thank you for kind of bringing this to my attention because I definitely went down a rabbit hole. And so I wanted to also ask about, as you're creating and applying some of the symbols that you did around the figures, you know, what sort of the meaning of the spikes, nails, railroad spikes, the hats, like the cowrie shell, just some of those symbols and what, you know, made you incorporate them into these particular works.
I have a deep interest in amulets and talismans from various cultures around the world and the kinds of things that people use to protect themselves, to heal themselves. And so a lot of the imagery comes from West and Central Africa, as well as the Southern United States, which I'm most familiar with. And so the nails are from these Nkisi figures, which I think is Central African Congolese. And, you know, then I was also reading about gods from West Africa that were, you know, really focused on the healing and well-being of people who were ill or who, you know, had to endure mental challenges. And so I kind of combined those layers because, you know, what I was thinking often, especially if you're a Black person or person of color in the United States, having to deal with the health system, you have to be your own advocate at that moment when you're most vulnerable. And so having to hold those two things at the same time, that's pretty tough. And again, because I'm doing this at the same time that we're all living through a pandemic, and I think we're not really talking about this, but we're still in a mental health crisis. We're still not acknowledging it. People are still trying to grapple with what it meant to have to really sit with yourself, because most of us don't sit with ourselves and really think about what it means to be in our bodies and how to interact with the broader environment. And so I think our culture has been heavily impacted, whether we talk about it or not. I know I feel it a lot. I feel there's a lot of aggression in our culture. I feel like people are more impatient, they're more rude. They feel more empowered to say whatever they want to say. We don't seem to edit anymore. And so, you know, again, I'm balancing, I'm paying attention to these two things, what happened a century ago and where we are now. And in some ways, we haven't come that far. In terms of how we talk about and think about these things. And so I'm really interested again in how we find peace and how we still our minds, because I don't think you can have rest if you don't have quiet in your own mind. And so, again, just exploring that.
Yes. Well, I'll segue then maybe to you, Brittany, just off of the last thing that you said, rest in the mind. And maybe if you want to give like a quick description of what sort of inspired your installation and the videos and the pose of the figure in front.
Yeah, I was definitely inspired by a conversation I had with a former coworker when the pandemic started. And we were kind of just, talking trash about it, you millennials and your phone. But then we ended the conversation with, well, I guess I can't, say too much about your generation because, my friends and even, some of my elders, they use Facebook to go to church, and just kind of like this relationship with technology. And I really had a difficult time thinking about rest, because it's something I have a very huge problem with, particularly with, like you said, getting to your own mind. And even with these phones and these devices, I see that they are making efforts to try and make us aware of how much time we're spending on it. We have the do not disturb feature now, which is represented by this crescent moon, which I thought was really interesting. But at the same time, our dependency on these devices and, technology in general, it can help foster rest and relaxation, and it can also hinder it. We have music and all these music apps and, yoga classes that you take online, but also that are interrupted by Microsoft Outlook and Instagram and phone calls. So it's definitely a grapple in my mind. I'm sure other people can relate to that as well.
And maybe if you want to talk about the influence of yoga and meditation.
Yeah, for sure. I've been learning I'm not a yoga practitioner. It's something that I will go to if I feel like, oh, my back or this. And I think that yoga has been definitely, how do I put this? It's been westernized a lot, and I think that westernization also contributes to, body dysmorphia and issues, because it's become an aesthetic. It's like the Lululemon, Lululemon aesthetic. And I think for me, learning that yoga is about your personal relationship to whatever pose you're doing. Siddhasana is the pose that I'm doing in the video and what the figure is doing. That pose actually, it's called easy pose. That pose really isn't that easy for me. Or for a lot of people, and
To sit cross-legged
to
like
sit
that.
cross-legged for, long periods of time. You start sometimes your practice with that pose, sitting there and breathing. And I notice if I'm in that pose, my breathing is like very shallow and, my heart rate is increasing. So just really understanding what works for me and not paying attention to the aesthetics. I've had classes where someone's called out and look what they're doing, and, just kind of focusing on what it feels like in my body has been a challenge and something I'm working towards.
And I have a question for you, but I think I'll pose it to everybody, maybe at the end, because we all sort of touch on this idea between sleeping and resting and the difference that there is. And so I jumped to Katie. Yeah. Thinking about that. And you spoke a little bit in your introduction, but maybe just like, I'm curious what this sort of examination of your body and the series that you work on, and how this is sort of like, how does rest show up, in your life and in
So I guess it's just a guiding force and how I navigate that. I deal with chronic illness. I have chronic Lyme. And so I deal with a lot of nerve pain and certain sensations within my body. And so when it comes to rest, or when it comes to staying still, that's when my body starts to wake up to a lot of these sensations and I feel them, which can make it difficult to actually find rest. And so with my work, I'm trying to contextualize all these sensations that I'm feeling, and not be so afraid of them, but more just acknowledge them so that I can breathe through it and, figure out what my body is trying to tell me. And then I use that to make work. And then sometimes I use the work to understand my body.
And particularly the one behind us, you're going through like the motion.
Yes.
The physical movement, the tossing and turning, to be able to find that like sort of sweet spot, right? Like
Yeah.
that pose. that you can actually like relax in. Yeah, exactly. And so I want to also ask about, there's this work on this wall here. And when we were doing the studio visit, I just kept thinking about this quote from Beloved, where she talks about Beloved and saying she's a friend of my mind. And this idea that, like, we're sort of describing that confrontation of what may stop you
Yeah.
from rest, physical or mental. So I just kind of wanted maybe to talk about like the interaction between the two figures.
I think the easiest way for me to start talking about that is just the figures in red and the difference between the figures in red and the figures that are what I consider full color. And I think of they tend to be the ones that are fully in rest on the bottom of all the layers of bodies there. But I tend to think of the color being more myself as it's seen by everyone around me, and maybe more of my wholeness, whereas the figures in red are either my own thoughts or past actions, which is the one back here is thinking about the tossing and turning, and so the memory of that. And then for the piece that you're talking about, where there's the interaction between the two, that has to do with my self-care, helping myself heal. So me taking care of me, and what that looks like, but it's also an acknowledgement of the pain that's in my body, and strangely knowing that it's always going to be there. And so there's a certain kind of comfort or predictability that I know that I can rely, that it's always going to be there.
The constant.
Yeah.
And Holly, I'll answer to you, because there was a lot of overlap in the poses in Katie's work and in your video, and you both sort of referenced Olympia, which is a very famous painting in art history by Manet, and it's usually written about as the first sort of like confrontational gaze against the male gaze in art history. But of course, there's another figure in the painting who was a famous Black model at the time in France, and sort of goes unwritten about until later scholarship that you referenced, in your work. So I just wanted to maybe you could talk about that pose and sort of what led you to take that pose, and then I'll ask a question about the video.
I mean, that's one of those paintings, I think, as a Black woman and artist, when you're trying to look for yourself in the canon of art. I think certainly Manet's Olympia stands out because of this Black female figure holding the flowers, whose name we didn't know for so long. I only recently learned her name. I think the scholarships has been in the past 10 years or less. And so that's, it's like this presence and absence, right? She's there, but she doesn't have a name. And she's there in service of the main figure, who is this, white female figure that's looking directly into the viewer's eyes. And so I thought a lot about like, am I going to do exactly Olympia's pose? Am I going to do a nude? Am I going to am I just flipping the sort of race and positionality? And I didn't want to do that. So what I wanted to do was sort of merge the two. And that's why the bouquet of flowers that's in the video, it's like I pick up the flowers from the floor and give them to myself. But just finding that way of not being oppositional. And so for me, it was important. There are moments when I open my eyes, but it was also important for me to get to a sense of rest internally. And also thinking about this idea of performance and authenticity, because most of my work is performance. So I'm like, am I performing rest or am I resting?
And with the flowers, I also thought about, the phrase giving someone their flowers while they're still here.
Yeah.
It's appreciation of people while they're still around, their accomplishments. And so I'll pose this question to you, but it is sort of a general question, for all the artists, like, and something that I think we're talking about in the show is whether rest is a reward. And if there is a connection, between rest as a reward and a reward for acknowledgements. And if you wanna
Yeah.
kick that off.
I did think of that phrase very literally of giving someone their flowers. And so the title kind of references, my French is terrible. I don't know if it's Laura or Lore or how you,
I'm not sure either.
right, but let's just, in English, it would be Laura, the model. And so I think there's a way in which artists and scholars are giving her flowers, but posthumously.
Mhm.
And then symbolically, yeah, I wanted to give myself my flowers too, and so.
Yeah, because if you
Very
don't
literal
give
gesture.
yourself, right, the
Right.
flowers. I also think about, just additionally, if anyone wants to do more research, there's that, painting by Elizabeth Colombo
Yes, yeah,
that depicts, Laura Marie, like, arriving to a modeling job. And so she's fully clothed, she's like got her stuff, like she's strutting down the street, she's owning the scene. And so there is a lot of an attempt to give this model for flowers, who appears in more Manet paintings. And we have a little, like, reading room, rest area, rest stop, no, set up over there. And there's a book in there, that's called Posing Modernity. And it talks about, starts with Manet's Olympia and moving forward. If anyone wants to read more about, that's referenced here in a few works. And then more about flowers, it's Joshua. So I wanted, if you could talk about the sort of power of gardening and what kind of led you to exploring gardening in the pandemic, and then sort of the reclamation of soil and gardening and working in that way, as a Black woman and artist.
Well, initially, I was just trying to come up with an approach to the theme of rest, and it was really hard for me to tell you the truth, because I feel like I've never really well rested. So I felt like, I needed to take a different approach. So what I ended up doing was kind of taking a segue and focusing on gardening, and not so much on myself, but I kind of focused on 3 women, Black women in the community that used that were gardening and the effects that it had on them. And ended up interviewing these 3 women in the community. 2 of them had garden plots in Reston, and one of them had a small plot like on their patio. And just trying to examine what that meant to them and what kind of effect it had on them in terms of their, not only their rest, but just how they ended up like navigating their lives. And it was interesting because 2 of the women were immigrants, one from Liberia, and one was from Liberia, one was from the Dominican Republic, and the other one had roots in the South. And I ended up really being interested in how they navigated their practices, but also like what were the things that informed their choices in terms of what they grew. And I found that a lot of that had to do with their upbringing, their roots. And what started to really fascinate me was the whole idea of Black people and their relationship to the soil. Because I think we have a very contentious relationship to the earth, being African Americans, right? Because for the most part, some of our earliest relationships with the soil had to do with our legacy of slavery. Working the land, working the soil for the benefit of others. And the whole concept of, Black people and their labor, and what that meant to the economy of the United States. Something that isn't always acknowledged, right? That free labor part, and also how we as a people ended up navigating that and still being able to reclaim parts of that for our own self and our own families. Because in spite of the day break to sunset work that we did, we always managed to preserve some of that labor for ourselves to feed our families and to heal ourselves, right? The herbs and everything that were grown. So those were the things that I was interested in when I was creating the word.
And, yeah, I think Brittany's just whispering, it's beautiful. Which I agree with. And, so for these print series here, you were actually using some of the plant matter, from the gardens, right? And I
Yeah,
just wondered-
which was kind of cool. I mean, the women were generous enough to lend some of the plant matter. And I used those in the making of these prints. And then the insulation that's over here, I kind of focused on the tomato plants. So, we nicknamed that the tomato piece because it kind of held up by the tomato cage, right, that gardeners typically use. But when I think about it, it's kind of hilarious in the sense that I am not a gardener. I can't grow anything, but I have a really full appreciation of people that can. And one of the gardeners, I just look at her in her garden and how much joy it brings to her. And I'm convinced that there's like this, the garden has this power to restore and heal and to rejuvenate the spirit. And so that's what I kind of focused on in this body of work.
And in Garden Clove, that's the title of the piece wrapped around the tomato cage. I know when we were first sort of doing our studio visits and talking about the show, you were thinking about this cocoon idea and like a safety and a solitude place, a warm sort of like area for rest. And I just wonder, how this Garden Clove kind of still gives that cocoon idea and the protections that it comes with living in the garden.
Yeah, it's really bizarre though, as an artist, when you come to an idea, you try a lot of different approaches and sometimes things do not work. And with this body of work, I was led by this idea, this concept, but also the spirit of it. Because I was determined in the beginning to make this cocoon-like structure. And I took a class to learn how to form these armatures out of wire and wrap them with paper. And it just didn't work. There were so many things that didn't work. And you go through all these processes and you get nervous and you start to panic. And speaking of rest, I got them done, for months. But that piece, the one that's sitting on the floor, eventually manifested itself in that form, which I think was really interesting. But I ended up with a cocoon-like feel to it, and I really wanted it to be a piece where you could sit and kind of contemplate. And I was also interested in the enclosure, a piece that would give you a sense of being protected. Because a lot of times we don't get that. So in that regard, I felt like I did something. And I feel like I kind of met what I was aiming for after a lot of struggle.
So I want to, I guess, open up to some questions, and if the other artists have questions for some of the artists, first I just want to read a little quote that came up in my research. I was reading through Art of My Mind, just by Bell Hooks, and that's also in our library here. And this is kind of an abbreviated quote. And I found it sort of towards the end of my research, but it was reassuring to know that, this was not a new concept. I am a girl who dreams of leisure, always have. Revere has been necessary to my existence. I have needed long hours where I'm stretched out, wearing silks, satins, and cashmeres, just alone with myself, embraced by the beauty around me. This solitary space is sometimes a place where dreams and visions enter, and sometimes a place where nothing happens. Yet it is as necessary to active work as water is to growing things. It is this stillness, this quietude, needed for the continued nurturing of any devotion to artistic practice, to one's work, that remains a space women, irrespective of race, class, nationality, etc., struggle to find in our lives. So that just really resonated around rest with me. So I don't know if we have anything coming in from online or how we want to maybe open up if anyone in the audience has questions or comments about the work, the artist or rest. Yes, no.
Hi. I'm chatting with our public programs manager who's monitoring the Zoom chat. No questions so far. But I had a question for you, Deirdre.
Mhm.
Can you say a few words about the poems that
Oh, yeah.
you were this exhibition
Sure.
inspired you to write that are written on the vinyl and walls?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so, in my curating, and in general in my life, there are two things. So, I'd say like maybe about 10 or so years ago, I developed this like tactic for anxiety where I would write haikus. It's sort of similar to like, there's like breathing techniques, right? Like 4-5-4 breath, or these things where if you're feeling anxious, you identify something you can hear, something you can smell, something you can see, these things to like bring down your sensory. And just like the 5-7-5 and like thinking about that. So I started like writing all these small haikus. And those will come up in other printed things for the exhibition. So then as I started curating too, and you have to write a curatorial statement and these essays, like I just had more of a inspiration with poem and the poem form. So usually I always have like these poems in the background when I'm thinking about exhibitions. And so for rest, I went, while we were doing this research, I went on like a rest vacation, I guess, to do some research and process everything. And I started the Rest is the List poem. And just thinking about all the things that rest is outside of just, like laying down for a nap, or we talk about self-care, putting on a mask or taking a hot bath. And like, these are things that can sort of feel like temporary fixes, right? But I wanted to expand, like, what is rest? What am I discussing and posing with this exhibition that rest is? So that's where the list poem comes from. And that's what I would define rest as. And there's things like eating a peanut butter cup or an affirmation. It goes on and on. And then the poem back here, which doesn't, I guess, have a title, but we've sort of been calling it like the Breonna poem, talking about Breonna Taylor. And during the demonstrations in 2020, we're seeing people discussing about how Breonna Taylor was asleep, when the police charged in to her home and murdered her. And it came up too in some of the discussions, like when Holly and I were talking, thinking about this instance of a student at Yale who was sleeping in the library, and like a Karen came along and just like decided that this was not a student. This woman didn't, it's like sleeping in a library on a college campus is probably the most common thing you would see. But this woman, this student was attacked, Black female, for that. And just like the vulnerability that rest also brings, not only getting to rest, but when you are there, and how you can still be exposed and vulnerable. And so that's the inspiration behind this poem back here, thinking about like who gets rest and how. And why, when, just all of these questions about what the privilege of rest, to be rested, to have your needs met, is something that is really an action you have to work towards. So that those two poems are about, and some of the other haikus, will be maybe in the catalog. And maybe I'll pull one up, if someone else wants to.
Wanna read it first?
Yeah, I'll just give me a second. I didn't print it out. And also, I guess I'll say, while I was working on this show, I also had a research project from Washington Project for the Arts. I have received some funding to do research around a project that I call the Colored Exit. And that sort of relates to like burnout and then soft life and rest. And while I was doing that research, sort of established like a cycle that a lot of us probably go through, where you're working and you're working and you're working, and you just have to get things done. You need money for your life. You just need to move forward. There's ideas you want to put out, and you're working, you kind of reach a point where you can't do it anymore. You have your exit, and then rest is like on the other side of that. So that was another one. Okay, so, let's see. One of the haikus I wrote is rest radically, consider the other side after suffering. And that's titled, If This Is How You Got Over, Then Where Are You Now? This is, so I also started doing research into after art and like after poems where it's like in art history, like a copy kind of thing, but there's this poet Wanda Coleman who does a lot of after poems I was really inspired by. So this one is after Toni Morrison, but it says, make use of the bomb, rest is a friend of my mind, coming back to life. And that's a reference in Beloved, where friend of my mind, as I mentioned earlier, but there's also this scene where Setha is having her feet rubbed, like after they sort of just like seized up and locked up from overwork, and the pain that you experience, like if your leg falls asleep and you kind of like shake it back up and there's like this sort of pain transition. And that one, and then I didn't want the show to focus so much on I guess trauma, or the trauma that without rest, because, and I think that as people look at rest, especially Black artists and female artists, we're providing more counters to the imbalance in the canon that surrounds Black art, and looking towards and past maybe our past experience, and the trauma that's passed down into different subject matter, and being able to just have these like peaceful scenes that will counter some of the stuff that we've been shown before. So I have no more trauma art. I can only see myself at ease, fancy free. So those are my little haikus. Okay, so Hannah's giving me the wrap-up signal. And I know I really thank, people for being able to shift your energy. I know during an opening, sometimes it can be hard to just like sit down and talk about the work. So I really appreciate like everybody's focus and hearing the artists out. And if you have any more questions as you're walking around, I think, I'm approachable. I'll let people say for themselves. But thank you again.